Welcome to this tour of one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Comment below from where you're watching now because this story will influence you in ways you might not predict. The year is 1876, and in the Appalachian hills of West Virginia, something evil was about to eternally scar the memories of a little isolated hamlet. There has always been something special about the Appalachian Mountains. The valleys were covered in thick oak and pine forests, and the morning mist stole over the hills like. Ancient mysteries are concealed by a murky shroud. Back then, the region was still regarded a frontier, a location where the law took days to arrive, and where people managed their own problems, often in silence. Communities lived isolated from one another, separated by miles of narrow and perilous trails that wove between rocks and deep ravines. Everyone in Tucker County knew Margaret Hollis, not because of her common family name, but because of her strong presence. A woman of approximately 32, with dark hair, constantly wrapped up in a tight bun. Margaret, who lived alone in a wooden house high on a hill some 5 miles from the closest settlement. Parsons had eyes that appeared to pierce anyone who dared stare straight at her. The property had belonged to her late husband, who had died 3 years ago under circumstances no one liked to discuss openly. All they claimed was that he had fallen during a storm from a cliff. Margaret, however, was not your typical widow who turned to her neighbors for sympathy or assistance. She was self-sufficient in an almost unsettling way. She raised her own food, and she rarely visited the village, hunted with an old shotgun that had belonged to her husband, and raised hens. When she did, it was simply to trade animal skins for salt, kerosene, or fabric. People nodded curtly when they saw her, but they didn't talk much. She seemed to know things that others did not, and there was something about her that unnerved people. The first rumors started to surface in October of that year. Thomas Brennan, a farmer, was coming back from a visit to the nearby county when he decided to take a shortcut down the trail that passed near Margaret's farm. The golden sunlight was already disappearing through the trees toward the end of the afternoon. Thomas subsequently reported he heard something unusual coming from the direction of her residence. Instead of a scream, there was a deep, monotonous chant that sent shivers down his spine as it reverberated through the trees. He urged his horse on and rode forward without looking back. Days later, another traveler reported anything similar. This time, it was a merchant delivering products between communities. He also heard voices coming from Margaret's land, but couldn't tell if they belonged to one person or more. What troubled him most was that as he looked toward the home, he saw a faint light moving amid the trees, as if someone were carrying a lantern in circles around the property. But it wasn't typical walking. The light moved wildly, sometimes too swiftly, sometimes pausing, entirely for several minutes before starting again. People in the community started talking. Any unexpected behavior was interpreted negatively in a place where superstition was still very much alive, and where witchcraft tales had been stoked around the fire since colonial times. Suspicion already surrounded Margaret, but now it was more intense. She was reported to communicate with spirits. Others asserted that she engaged in prohibited rites that were taught to her by the native people who lived on these regions long before the colonists did. Came. The local clergyman, Reverend Samuel Whitmore, sought to interfere. One November morning, he and 2 congregation members went over to Margaret's house. They knocked on the door for several minutes, but no one replied. There was still a faint line of smoke coming from the chimney, but the house seemed vacant. They circled the property and found something that severely concerned them. In the backyard, there were traces on the ground forming circular patterns, as if something or someone had been pulled repeatedly, around a focal point. They discovered animal bones that had been purposefully placed close to the marks, creating symbols that neither of them could recognize. After his return to the village, Reverend Whitmore convened a meeting at the church. The conversation was intense. Margaret should be directly challenged and questioned about her actions, according to others. Others maintained that she was harming no one, and that everyone had the freedom to live as they liked, as long as they did not interfere in the lives of others. However, a third was smaller, more radical organization that advocated for more extreme actions. This group considered that Margaret constituted a serious danger, something that needed to be eradicated before she brought disgrace to the entire town. While the local arguments raged, Margaret continued her quiet existence on the hill. No one knew exactly what she was doing up there, alone in that house, surrounded by dark, silent forests. However, a moment that would alter everything was about to occur, something that would startle and change the entire community. Margaret Hollis became a terrifying legend in that Appalachian area. In the Appalachians, winter came early that year. Trails became nearly difficult when the first snowfall fell in mid-November, covering the hills in a white blanket. Families hunkered down in their houses, loading up on firewood and food for the chilly months ahead. Each property became an island encircled by miles of snow-covered forests as the area's natural isolation grew. It was during this period when Margaret Hollis did something absolutely unexpected. On a gloomy December morning, she rode her ancient, scrawny horse down to the village of Parsons. People who spotted her passing through the streets were astonished. Margaret had not been to the village in months, so her arrival created a stir right away. Ignoring the suspicious and inquisitive looks that followed her, she tied her horse in front of the general shop and entered with firm steps. Margaret bought an odd number of supplies inside the store: 3 gallons of kerosene, thick textiles, needles, strong thread, a lot of salt, and something that drew the storekeeper Henry Dodson's attention. Margaret requested chains. Not small chains for harnessing livestock or hanging goods, but thick chains. The kind used for carrying logs or securing huge constructions. In an attempt to appear casual, Henry asked Margaret why she needed them, but all she could do was stare at him with those dark eyes before responding that it was to solve a problem on her land. Henry sold the chains without further inquiries, but as soon as Margaret left the shop, he began informing everyone he met. The news traveled swiftly throughout the village. What would a lone woman do with such heavy chains on a solitary mountaintop during the winter? There was much speculation. According to some, she was constructing an odd edifice. Others said that the chains were employed in sinister ceremonies. Some even thought Margaret was getting ready for something horrible that was still to come. The days passed, and winter was more severe. Snow continued to pour and temperatures plunged. Roads were blocked, and village-to-village contact essentially stopped. The first disappearance took place in this setting of complete seclusion. Jacob Mercer, who lived in a little cabin approximately 3 miles from Margaret's farm, just disappeared. Jacob was a skilled hunter who was renowned for his ability to track bears and deer under the most trying circumstances. Like Margaret, he lived alone and frequently spent weeks in the woods without any updates. But this time was different. Jacob had told his brother, who lived in Parsons, that he would come down to the hamlet before Christmas to assist him repair the roof of his house. After Christmas, Jacob failed to appear. Before setting up a search party, the anxious brother waited a few more days. When they finally got it up to Jacob's cabin in early January of 1877, they found it vacant. The fireplace was cold, the door was opened, and Jacob had left some signs inside, in a rush. No hunter in that area would go unarmed. Thus, it was really strange that his shotgun was still hanging on the wall. They discovered a loaf of stale bread and a half-empty coffee mug on the table, as though he had been interrupted in the middle of his meal. The search party followed the footsteps leading from the cabin. The snow-covered tracks headed straight north toward Margaret Hollis's land. They followed the route for approximately 2 miles, but then the traces abruptly disappeared. There was no logical explanation. The tracks in the snow terminated abruptly in a clearing, as if Jacob had been lifted off the ground or dissipated into thin air. The snow was oddly disturbed around the track's stop, with circular patterns that looked like they had been in Margaret's yard months before. The search party's guys were perplexed. They debated among themselves in an attempt to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe Jacob had gone back, but there was no sign of him. Maybe an animal had attacked him and pulled him away, but there were no traces of a struggle, no tooth marks, claw marks, or blood. In that specific location in the forest, it seemed as though Jacob Mercer had just vanished. Like wildfire, word of the disappearance spread throughout the area. Margaret Hollis's name began to be spoken even more frequently. Although no one could pinpoint how or why, many people thought she was involved in Jacob's disappearance. Some of the most superstitious started discussing witchcraft and curses in public. They stated Margaret had summoned terrible spirits that now prowled the forests, dragging away those who wandered too close to their territory. The Tucker County Sheriff, William Garrett, was urged to investigate. He was a practical man who disregarded tales of witches and ghosts, but he sensed that something was seriously up. Midway through January, Garrett assembled 3 deputies and made the decision to visit Margaret's home in order to speak with her face-to-face regarding Jacob Mercer's abduction. The ascent of the climb was tough, the snow was deep, and the horses strained to make headway on the limited pathways. When they finally reached Margaret's property, the sun was already low over the horizon, creating long, warped shadows across the terrain. The house seemed dismal and silent, with only a thin line of smoke emerging from the chimney. They got off their horses and walked warily to the front door. Sheriff Garrett banged forcefully on the door, announcing himself and insisting that Margaret open it. A long period of stillness ensued. Then, gradually, the rusty hinges of the door creaked open. In a dark, faded dress, Margaret emerged in the doorway, her hair falling loosely down her shoulders in a way that none of them had ever seen her. She simply gazed at them with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through them without saying anything. Garrett wanted to know if she had any information regarding the disappearance of Jacob Mercer. After Margaret had been silent for a while, a small, hardly noticeable smile crept to the corners of her lips. She spoke only one sentence, her voice calm and chilly, making the men's blood run cold. Those who disregarded the mountains, she claimed, always paid a price. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you're following this investigation. Tell people who like real dark mysteries this tale to avoid missing any details of this case, which will lead us to even more unsettling areas. Turn on alerts. Sheriff Garrett and his deputy couldn't get Margaret's comments out of their heads. Way down the slope, that enigmatic phrase about the mountains taking a toll wasn't quite a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. It was something far worse, a suggestion that she was fully aware of what had happened to Jacob Mercer, but was unwilling to share it. Garrett sought to pursue Margaret with more questions that chilly afternoon. He asked whether she had seen Jacob in the days before he went, if she had heard anything weird in the woods surrounding his property, if she knew of any reason Jacob might be moving in the direction of his residence. After extended silences and blank looks in response to each query, Margaret ultimately stated that she was under no duty to respond to inquiries without official charges. Garrett was aware that she was correct. He had no right to detain her or compel her to comply in the absence of hard proof, witnesses, or even a body. Before leaving, Garrett sought permission to see the property. Margaret vehemently objected, claiming that her house was her haven and that no one could enter there without a court order. Garrett had no method of securing such an order at that point, especially with the roads blocked by snow and the nearest court days away. All he and his deputies could do was get on horseback and head back to Parsons, bringing with them more questions than answers. The community received reports of the futile visit with mounting frustration and worry. If the law enforcement official, the sheriff, was unable to get Margaret to speak, then who could? Jacob Mercer's disappearance placed everyone on high. Be mindful. People began locking their doors more carefully and avoiding venturing out alone, especially around twilight. Hunters started operating in groups, never by themselves, after mothers cautioned their kids not to approach the trails leading to Margaret's Hill. There was a brief thaw in February. On the lower slopes, the snow started to melt, exposing the dirty, brown ground below. It was during this moment that another bizarre event shocked the town. A farmer called Edwin Thatcher, who resided with his wife on a land some 6 miles from Parsons, stated that for 3 consecutive nights he observed lights moving in the distant mountains in the approximate direction of Margaret's residence. Edwin reported the lights as like torches or lanterns, but they didn't move like individuals carrying lights. The lights climbed, sank, and floated, creating incomprehensible patterns in the blackness. On the 3rd night, Edwin woke his wife, Martha, so she could observe the phenomena as well. They both agreed that something was there, and Martha attested to having seen the lights. Profoundly unnatural about their movements. The tale circulated swiftly. Other locals started observing the mountains at night, and a number of them claimed to have seen the enigmatic lights. Some reported hearing far-off noises coming from the same direction, such as wailing or chants carried through the valleys by the wind. The mood in the region became fraught with tension and superstition. Reverend Whitmore continued speaking sermons about demonic forces and the significance of maintaining faith in the face of the evil that stalked the hills. Then followed the second disappearance. After her husband passed away 2 years prior, Rachel Peaton, a woman in her 40s living alone, disappeared without a trace. About 7 kilometers away from Margaret's land, Rachel resided in a modest home on the banks of a stream. She was recognized for her skill in preparing herbal treatments and often assisted the sick in the neighborhood with her concoctions. Rachel was last seen on a Saturday afternoon visiting the village to sell some jam, jars, and purchase flour. She said that she was worried about what she had discovered close to her home in a brief conversation with Father Michael O'Brien, the local Catholic priest. When the priest inquired what it was, Rachel hesitated, seemed about to say something, but then changed the subject and stated it was nothing important. When a neighbor paid Rachel a visit on Monday morning, she discovered the house was empty. The door was open, swinging in the breeze. Everything inside appeared normal, with the exception of one unsettling. Specifics. Mud footprints formed a circular pattern on the main room floor, as though someone had been going in circles again and over. The tracks came from outside, entered via the door, circled the room several times, and finally exited again. However, Rachel's shoes did not match the single set of footprints. Before long, a bunch of people began searching Rachel's home when the neighbor went for assistance. They discovered food in the cupboard, her bed made, and her clothes still hanging out to dry. Everything showed that she planned to come back. But as they followed the muddy tracks heading from the home, the trail led them to the creek bank and then disappeared into the flowing water. Rachel was nowhere to be seen. When Sheriff Garrett was summoned once more, he brought additional men. For days, they scoured the neighborhood surrounding Rachel's home, but they were unable to locate any sign of her. The waterway was explored upstream and downstream, but no corpse was recovered. It was as if Rachel had simply vanished into thin air, exactly like. Before her was Jacob Mercer. There was a panic among the community. In less than 2 months, 2 individuals who lived alone on homes that were reasonably close to Margaret Hollis's hill had vanished. It was hard to ignore the links, A group of locals gathered at the church and requested that the sheriff take serious action. They wanted Margaret arrested. Her house was searched by force, and she was made to answer for what was going on. Garrett was a lawman, but he was also pragmatic. He knew he couldn't arrest Margaret without tangible proof, but he also understood that something had to be done to soothe the populace's growing hysteria. He made the decision to plan a bigger trip to Margaret's land, bringing 12 armed men with him, 4 deputies, and 7 volunteers from the town. As soon as the weather allowed, the expedition was scheduled for early March. Garrett knew he was stepping on hazardous terrain. He may finally bring justice to the situation if he discovered something damning on Margaret's land. Victims. However, if he discovered nothing, he ran the possibility of making Margaret a martyr in the eyes of some and feeding the sinister rumors that were being spread about her. It was a big gamble, but it seemed the only alternative left. Something else occurred during the expedition's planning that would fundamentally alter the investigation's trajectory. In the woods west of Parsons, a hunter named Daniel Foster was pursuing a deer when he came across something that terrified him to his core, hanging from a high limb oven. He identified the venerable oak tree right away as a ripped piece of cloth. On the day Rachel Peton vanished, it was a part of the shawl she was wearing. For a few minutes, Daniel Foster remained still and gazed at the piece of cloth that was swaying gently in the cool March wind. Rachel's shawl was torn raggedly, as if it had been yanked off roughly. Something dark, possibly dried blood or muck, marred the fabric's edges. It was impossible to tell at this distance, and the hunter hurried back to Parsons as quickly as his legs would allow, mentally marking the precise location of the tree as light filtered through the treetops. By the time he arrived in the village, he was so agitated and out of breath that he could hardly speak. In the temporary office behind the church, he located Sheriff Garrett and recounted what he had uncovered. Garrett wasted no time. He grabbed 2 deputies and immediately followed Daniel back into the woods. When they arrived at the location, the sun was starting to disappear beneath the horizon. The tree was a huge oak, its trunk so broad that 3 men could hardly put their arms around it. The piece of fabric was dangling about 15 feet off the ground, implying someone or something had climbed all the way up to position it. Thomas Riley, a young, nimble deputy, was given the order by Garrett to climb up and get the fabric. Thomas struggled to ascend, holding on to the sharp branches. When he finally reached the shawl, he said something that caused the men below to exchange worried glances. He claimed that the branch had odd scratches on it, as though a sharp object had repeatedly scraped the wood, creating unintelligible patterns or letters. Garrett gave Thomas the order to come down right away with the cloth, and, if he could, a portion of the branch that had the marks on it. Thomas returned to the ground and gave the sheriff the scarf. Without a doubt, Rachel was wearing the identical one. Several villagers could confirm this. Dark streaks on the cloth were carefully investigated. Garrett sniffed and rubbed a tiny bit between his fingers. It didn't smell like blood. It resembled moist dirt combined with an unidentifiable substance. Thomas returned with a piece of twig that was obviously marked with deep scratches that resembled runes or ancient symbols. There were more questions than answers after the finding. Why is Rachel's shawl hanging in a tree so far away from her house? Back then, who or what had climbed it and left it there? And what? What did the wood-carved symbols mean? Garrett knew he needed answers, and he also knew those answers likely resided on the hill where Margaret Hollis lived, secluded from the rest of the world. They proceeded with the planned excursion to Margaret's estate. There was no more waiting for Garrett. Armed with rifles and revolvers, he assembled his company of 12 men the following morning and started the arduous ascent up the muddy, slush-covered trail. The atmosphere was tight. Nobody spoke. The thick hush that enveloped the group was broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the sound of horse hooves. When they arrived at Margaret's property at noon, things instantly appeared strange. There was no indication of life, no smoke rising from the chimney, and the home was very quiet. For the first time since Garrett's last visit, the windows were boarded up. The yard, which had those unsettling circular patterns before, was now spotless and vacant, as if the whole area had been meticulously swept. Garrett dismounted and approached the door warily, his palm resting on the handle of the handgun hooked to his belt. With a loud knock, he made his presence known and insisted that Margaret open it right away. There was no response. He yelled that he had the permission to break in if needed and pounded again, louder this time. There was still nothing but quiet. The sheriff nodded while glancing at his guys. 2 deputies approached with a hefty wood they had prepared, especially for this circumstance. With 3 thunderous knocks, the door gave way, the hinges shattering and the aged wood splintering. Armed and ready for anything, the crew walked into the house. The interior of the house was dismal and cold. Their eyes needed some time to acclimate to the darkness. They were profoundly horrified by what they saw as their vision improved. The house was deserted. There were no clothes, no kitchenware, and no furnishings. Mold and moisture stains were visible on the exposed walls. It was as if no one had lived there for years, not just days or weeks. But what attracted the most notice was the floor of the main room. Carved straight into the wood floorboards was a large circular pattern around 10 feet in diameter. None of the persons in attendance recognized the symbols and letters that made up the pattern. It wasn't English, nor was it any known European language. The carvings were deep and precise, definitely produced with time and care, not something quickly improvised. Garrett knelt to inspect the pattern more closely. The carving still had a somewhat new appearance. Compared to the rest of the floor, the exposed wood was less worn. He ran his fingers over the grooves, feeling the depth and regularity of the cuts. Whoever has done this had skill and determination. The men dispersed throughout the house, looking in every room. In what must have been the bedroom, they found more symbols scratched into the walls. In what was the kitchen, they discovered that the stone floor had been partially removed, revealing dark earth beneath. Recently, someone had dug there. Garrett ordered 2 men to grab shovels and begin digging there. Layers of wet black earth were removed during their hour-long excavation. The shovels hit a solid object about a meter below. After carefully clearing the area, the men uncovered what looked to be a wooden box that had been buried. Everyone gathered, holding their breath as the box was retrieved from the pit. The box was heavy, made of dark, sturdy wood with rusted iron hinges. There was only a basic latch that opened with ease. There was no lock. After a brief moment of hesitation, Garrett opened it, bracing himself for whatever might be within. He moved firmly and raised the lid. Contrary to what many had feared, there were no bodies or remains inside the box. Instead, they found a bewildering collection of objects. Thin ropes were used to tie dozens of tiny cloth bags. They found dried herbs, colored powders, polished stones with symbol engravings, and tiny animal bones, teeth, and claws inside the bags. There were also several pieces of yellowed paper covered with writing in a language no one could identify. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the other objects, Garrett found something that made his blood run cold. It was a tarnished, worn silver medallion hanging from a thin chain. He had seen the medallion before, so he recognized it instantly. Jacob Mercer owned it. It was a gift from his late mother, and the missing hunter always wore it around his neck. How had that medallion ended up in the box buried beneath Margaret's house? The men stared at each other in silence. The discovery was extremely unsettling, but it wasn't conclusive evidence of murder. There were only odd items and a locket that left more questions than it answered. No bodies, no blood, no confession. The most unsettling of all was Margaret Hollis's total absence. Where had she disappeared to? When had she left, and why had she left all that behind? Sheriff Garrett gave the order to search the entire house. The men searched every corner, every floorboard, every ceiling beam. There in the attic. Discovered additional proof of Margaret's unusual way of life. There were glass jars containing liquids of varying colors, some clear as water, others dark and viscous. Bundles of dried herbs tied with twine plants hung from the rafters. Some of the men knew they were used in traditional medicine, while others had no idea. They found an old chest secured with a rusty padlock in a corner of the attic. When they opened the lock after one of the deputies used an iron bar to force it, they discovered something that fundamentally altered their understanding of Margaret Hollis's true nature. Dozens of books, bound in worn leather, were inside the chest. The titles were in Latin, French, and Old English. They were treatises on Bodhi, astronomy, natural philosophy, and most disturbingly on practices the church would classify as occult. Garrett leafed through some of the volumes carefully. There were numerous handwritten notes in the book margins that were probably written by Margaret. She had underlined passages, made detailed drawings of plants and constellations, and copied symbols and formulas onto separate pages. Margaret was obviously not a simpleton, as many people in the village believed. She had knowledge that few people in that isolated Appalachian area had, and she was well-educated and well-cultured. But education and knowledge didn't explain the disappearances. The medallion that Jacob Mercer had buried under her home's floor was not explained. The odd markings, the carved symbols, the lights seen in the mountains at night. If anything, those books added to the mystery by implying that Margaret engaged in activities that were well beyond the realm of common knowledge. Garrett made the decision to investigate the area around the house while a few men persisted in searching it. He made his way to the rear, where the open area was being engulfed by the forest. There, partially hidden by the undergrowth, he found something he hadn't noticed on previous visits. It was a small, barely noticeable trail that meandered downhill toward a deep valley with thick old-growth trees. After calling 3 of his men, the sheriff made the decision to pursue the trail. The path was steep and treacherous, covered in exposed roots and loose rocks. They used branches for balance as they cautiously descended. The trail took them to a small, isolated clearing after about 20 minutes of arduous walking, completely encircled by trees so tall they almost blocked out the sun. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that made all the men stop in their tracks. About 1 meter high, it was a kind of altar composed of piled stones. On the altar were dark marks that could have been fire residue or something more sinister. Wooden stakes were hammered into the ground in a perfect circle around the altar. From each stake hung a different object. Cloth scraps, animal bones, and tiny bags filled with unidentified materials. Garrett was extremely cautious as he approached the altar. He looked at the patterns on the stone's surface, attempting to ascertain their nature. The porosity of the rock had absorbed the ancient dark stains. Without a thorough analysis, which he lacked the means to do at the time, it was impossible to say for sure. One of the representatives, a man named Samuel Brooks, who had grown up hearing ancient stories about the practices of the region's indigenous peoples, commented that the structure resembled altars used in shamanic rituals. Before colonization, he clarified, some tribes living in the Appalachians thought that specific places in the mountains were portals or points of connection to the spirit world. They conducted rituals, offered sacrifices, and thought they could speak with powers beyond human understanding. The idea that Margaret was practicing some form of these ancient rituals was both fascinating and terrifying. How far would she have gone to develop or preserve her power over occult forces if she really thought she had it. What was the connection between Rachel Peaton and Jacob Mercer? One of the men was searching the clearing, shouted from a far distance. At the edge of the vegetation he had discovered something. Everyone went over and saw what had prompted the alarm. Half covered behind dead leaves and twigs was a piece of apparel. Garrett recognized it instantly when he took it up and shook off the grime. On the day of his disappearance, Jacob Mercer was wearing this hunting shirt. Several Parsons inhabitants could attest to this, as Jacob always wore that particular shirt made of thick wool with a distinguishing red and plaid design in black. The clothing was shredded in multiple places, but there were no evident traces of blood or violence. It seems to have been torn off or removed quickly. Garrett carefully folded the shirt and kept it as proof. The discovery verified what he already believed: a direct connection between this place, Margaret Hollis, and the disappearances. They investigated the area surrounding the clearing for an additional hour, but they discovered nothing noteworthy. By the time they began climbing back to the home, the sun was already low and the temperature was falling quickly. Garrett gathered all the men back at the main farm and said that they would spend the night there. There was always the remote possibility that Margaret may come back, and he wanted to be sure they hadn't overlooked anything crucial. They took turns watching over a fire they had started in the backyard. The Appalachian night was unusually calm at that time of year. There was no singing of crickets or frogs, no distant howling of coyotes, simply any attempt at discussion seemed to be stifled by the suffocating, heavy quiet. The men gathered near the fire, keeping their hands warm and avoiding prolonged peering into the surrounding darkness. Around midnight, something happened that caused all the men instinctively reach for their firearms. From deep in the jungle, coming from the direction of the clearing where they had found the altar, a sound emerged. It was neither a typical human sound nor an animal sound. It was an echoing chant with a low pace, through the woods in a manner that warped its source. It appeared to be coming from all directions at once. The men stood still, listening. The chanting continued for several minutes, rising and falling in pitches that followed no recognized tune. Then the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. The hush that followed was much more awful than before. Garrett gave 2 men instructions to examine the track that led to the clearing, but both men vehemently refused. Neither of them was prepared to follow that sinister route in the midst of the evening, not in light of what they had witnessed during the day. The sheriff didn't make any demands. He was deeply reluctant to leave the relative protection of the campfire. They made the decision to hold off on looking into the sound's origin until morning. The rest of the night passed slowly, with the men alternating between restless dozes and nervous vigils. Everyone sensed that they were being watched from the darkness, a primitive, intuitive feeling that made the hairs on the back of their necks rise up, even though no one heard the song again. On end. Garrett gathered 5 men to descend back to the clearing as the sun finally rose, casting chilly gray light across the mountains. When they came, they found something that had not been there the day before. Something new was standing in the middle of the stone altar. It was a little doll made of twigs bound together with thin ropes with bits of fabric wrapped around it to form a primitive human figure. Attached to the doll with a rusty pin was a piece of paper with a single word scrawled in fading black ink. The word was a name: Garrett. Sheriff Garrett's quivering hands felt the light weight of the scratchy cloth and dry branches as he scooped up the doll. His men crowded around the thing, gazing at it with a mix of horror and fascination. The message was obvious and unmistakable. Margaret Hollis, or whomever had placed it there overnight, knew exactly who was investigating, knew her identity, and was delivering a warning. Congressman Samuel Brooks, who was acquainted with tales of ancient customs, clarified that dolls such as this were employed in numerous schools of sympathetic magic. The doll was supposed to be a representation of a real person, and any changes made to it would have an impact on that person. It was an effective kind of intimidation and threat. Even the most skeptical males in the group were clearly shaken. Garrett made a decision. They would get back to Parsons right away and set up a much bigger operation. More men were required. They required skilled trackers. Before something more serious occurred, they had to locate Margaret Hollis. From that point on, the property would be continuously secured, and any questionable activity in the vicinity would be looked into right away. It was a tense and quiet ride back to the village. The guys rode in tight formation, continually gazing to either side, expecting something or someone to burst from the trees at any moment. When they reached Parsons in the late afternoon, news of their discoveries traveled around the village like a tornado. An emergency meeting was called at the church the same evening. Nearly the whole adult population of Parsons gathered. About 80 people jammed into the wooden pews and standing around the walls. Reverend Whitmore launched the meeting with a prayer, asking for divine protection from the dark powers that seemed to have settled in the nearby mountains. Garrett described everything they had discovered on Margaret's land, including the literature on the occult, the altar in the clearing, the lost hunter's shirt, the symbols carved into the earth, the hidden box containing Jacob's pendant, and ultimately the doll carrying his name left overnight. The response from the community was swift and strong. The room was filled with cries of anger, terror, and wrath. Margaret should be hunted like an animal, according to some. Some proposed setting the home on fire. To keep an eye on the woodlands, some planned to organize vigilante groups. Garrett held up his palms, pleading for peace. He emphasized that despite all the circumstantial evidence, they still had no conclusive proof that Margaret had committed any crime. They had found no bodies. They have no witnesses to any aggressive activities. Although the missing's belongings were found on his premises, this did not prove murder. He had to adhere to the correct protocols as a law enforcement officer. Many people were frustrated by Garrett's remarks. Robert Hutchinson, a rancher, sprang up and yelled that 2 community members had vanished, that a woman who was obviously involved in demonic activities lived alone in the mountains doing sinister rites, and that the sheriff was more focused on court cases than on public safety. Many others in attendance found resonance in the charge. The Catholic priest who had spoken with Rachel Peton prior to her abduction, Father O'Brien, requested to speak. He stood slowly, his face expressing the age and fatigue of years serving that rural village. According to him, Rachel had stated something in passing during their most recent talk that he had not previously shared with her. She had reported seeing odd markings close to her house. She was profoundly upset by the symbols etched into the trees. Rachel claimed that although the markings appeared to be messages or warnings, she was unable to decipher their significance. The priest proceeded, saying that Rachel had also mentioned seeing Margaret Hollis strolling through the woods a few days earlier, in an area where there were generally no pathways or reason for anyone to be. Rachel had been frightened to approach or speak to Margaret, so she had merely watched from afar as the woman moved through the trees with slow steps, stopping periodically to examine something on the ground or mark trees with a knife. This revelation prompted renewed conflict in the church. Why had the priest not told anyone about this? When Rachel vanished, why hadn't he shared it right away? O'Brien said, his voice thick with shame, that he hadn't thought it relevant at the time. Rachel had casually brought up the incident without really thinking about it. He hadn't envisaged any serious risk. Now, looking back, the priest thought that perhaps he could have saved Rachel if he had taken her fears more seriously. Garrett took in this new knowledge. Margaret was delineating her domain, establishing a network of symbols or some sort of border over the forest. But where was she now, and for what reason? She must have departed quickly, based on the deserted property. But where? And why abandon anything that could be used as evidence? An old man at the back of the church raised his hand. It was one of the oldest people in the area. Elijah Crane came to Appalachia more than 50 years ago as a young man. Elijah rarely spoke at public meetings. Everyone turned to listen when he asked to speak. In a quiet but firm voice, he began to narrate a story few in the room knew. Elijah claimed that in the 1820s, when he was just a youngster, there was another woman who lived in seclusion in the mountains not far from where Margaret currently resided. Additionally, this woman was suspected of practicing herbal medicine. Medicine, and by the standards of the community, was also regarded as odd. Her name was Adelaide Marsh. The community eventually marched to Adelaide's house when individuals started going missing around that time, particularly young folks who went hunting or gathering water and never came back. Elijah claimed that what they discovered there was comparable to what Garrett had just stated. Strange items buried, symbols on the walls, and victims' possessions concealed all throughout the place. Adelaide was taken into custody and, despite the formal charges being murder, they were prosecuted for witchcraft. But before they could carry out the punishment, Adelaide fled from the improvised prison where she was being confined. They escaped to the mountains and were never seen again. After she escaped, the disappearances stopped. Elijah stopped and looked around the strained faces in the chapel. Then he revealed something that made everyone's blood run cold. At the time of the incidents, Adelaide Marsh's daughter was approximately 5 years old. Adelaide fled, and the girl was abandoned before being taken in by an Eastern agricultural family. That girl's name was Margaret. The church was completely silent. The consequences of Elijah's revelation were tremendous. Margaret Hollis was more than simply an oddball who followed bizarre customs. Decades before, she was the daughter of someone who had been charged with identical crimes. There was a continuity and a bloodline that indicated the techniques and information were being passed down through the generations. Garrett sensed. His shoulders became heavier with responsibility. He wasn't just dealing with a missing persons investigation anymore. He was facing something considerably older and more profound, something that had roots in this area long before any of the people in the room were even born. Margaret had to be found. But now he recognized she wouldn't be found unless she wanted to be found. She knew these mountains better than anyone, had heard tales of her mother's escape as a child, knew just how to blend in. The conference concluded with the establishment of multiple search parties. In order to cover as much ground as possible, volunteers volunteered to patrol various mountain regions in shifts. Garrett set up a system of signals, fires that would be ignited in the event that someone discovered Margaret's location. Fear and a resolve to solve this riddle once and for all bonded the town. However, that evening, as Garrett sat by himself in his tiny office, going over all the material, gazing at, he thought about Jacob's locket, Rachel's shawl, and the eerie doll with his name. What if Margaret wasn't running away? What if all of this was a part of a bigger scheme that they were still unaware of? What if the disappearances marked the start of something far worse rather than its conclusion? The wind howled through the trees in the shadowy Appalachian mountains, conveying secrets that had been kept hidden for generations. Somewhere in that enormous forest and shadows, Margaret Hollis waited and observed. The atmosphere of Parsons and the surrounding area completely changed in the days after the church gathering. What had previously been a tranquil village of farmers and workers, where everyone knew each other by name and doors were rarely shut, had now become a place marked by continual surveillance and mistrust. Groups of armed men patrolled the routes from sunrise to sunset, and no one ventured alone beyond the borders of their land anymore. Garrett divided the territory into sectors and assigned particular teams to each area in order to methodically arrange the search. They searched for any clue that someone had been residing in the woodlands, such as trails carved through the foliage, extinguished campfires, or signs of recent campsites. The Appalachian Mountains were enormous and unforgiving, with thousands of spots where a person could hide for months without being detected. There were deep tunnels, quiet valleys, clearings hidden behind dense curtains of greenery. During the first week of searching, they found numerous intriguing but inconclusive findings. They found the remnants of a fire that looked like it had just been started in a cave some 15 kilometers from Margaret's deserted home. Markings on the cave floor, symbols carved into the stone that mirrored those in Margaret's home, surrounded the ashes. But there were no additional traces of occupation, no clothing, no utensils, nothing to suggest anyone had truly lived there. Another time, one of the search. Parties noticed a tree marked with deep notches. As the same symbols appeared in other places throughout the mountains, the incisions created patterns that the investigators were now starting to recognize. One of the volunteers, a man who had worked as a surveyor when he was younger, proposed that the marks could create a network or map that connected particular locations across the forest. If it was a map, however, nobody could figure out what it meant. As the unsuccessful searches went on, an unexpected development occurred in the village. A woman called Dorothy Simmons, who ran Parsons's only boarding house, approached the sheriff with alarming information. Dorothy clarified that a stranger had spent 3 nights at her boarding house approximately 2 weeks before, to Rachel Patton's abduction. The man was not like the other tourists who went by. He walked across the mountains for days at a time, returning only at sunset, dressed in dark, well-made clothes, and talked with an accent Dorothy couldn't identify. A stranger had inquired about the area, the isolated families, local traditions, and old tales. Dorothy assumed he was just a scholar or a folklore enthusiast. So, without much thought, she responded to his queries. But after reflecting on previous chats, she realized the man had taken particular attention when she mentioned Margaret Hollis and her reputation in the town. Garrett asked Dorothy to elaborate. What did the man look like? She said he was in his middle years, with silver hair and a nicely groomed beard and light-colored eyes that seemed to analyze everything with analytical seriousness. He carried a large leather satchel that he never left unattended, and Dorothy had spotted him writing continuously in a notebook. When the man left after the 3rd night, he didn't indicate where he was going, simply paying for his stay and headed north into the mountains. This new knowledge created unsettling opportunities. Was there some relation between this mysterious guest and the subsequent events? Was he an accomplice of Margaret's or perhaps an investigator of some kind? Someone who is likewise intrigued by the peculiar customs that exist in those mountains. Garrett dispatched letters to sheriffs in adjacent counties describing the man and asking if anyone had seen or heard of him. The responses that arrived over the following weeks were all unfavorable. The snow eventually fully melted from the lower slopes as March gave way to April. Spring started to change the woodlands where green is returning to the environment and new buds are growing on the trees. But the revived beauty of nature contrasted dramatically with the melancholy spirit that lingered in the neighborhood. Margaret was still being sought, but less assiduously. The men needed to return to work on their farms, planting the spring crops, maintaining the animals. They couldn't dedicate all of their attention to looking for a woman who appeared to have vanished. The 3rd disappearance occurred during this seemingly peaceful time. Happened. William Foster, the elder brother of Daniel, the hunter who had discovered Rachel's shawl hanging in the tree, was the victim this time. William was around 52 years old, a widower and lived alone in a hut on the banks of the Cheat River, which meandered its way through the valleys. William was last observed returning some borrowed tools to a neighbor on a Thursday afternoon. He added that he expected to spend the next few days repairing the roof of his cabin, which had been damaged by winter storms. The next Sunday, when his brother Daniel came to visit, he saw the cabin vacant and the repair tools strewn all over the floor, as though William had suddenly stopped working. However, this wasn't the most unsettling aspect of the situation. On the cabin door, someone had drawn a sign using what appeared to be charcoal or ash. It was the same kind of symbol that was on the scarred trees and in the cave near Margaret's house. The drawing was new, likely made within the last 24 hours. The person who had done it was aware. William Foster had lately traveled to the precise place where he lived. There was tremendous alarm when the third disappearance was reported. The neighborhood, which had started to loosen up a little in the hopes that the worst was behind them, now had to face the fact that the threat was still very much alive. Garrett set up a second, more thorough search of the vicinity of William's cabin right away. They had an advantage this time. Since the symbol on the door was recent, the person who did it might still be in the area. The trackers discovered tracks close to the river in the mud. Before vanishing under the rocks, the marks, which belonged to comparatively small women's boots, ran upstream for roughly 2 miles. Following the river's path, the men looked at every bank, tributary, and potential hiding spot. They eventually arrived at a location where the river created a 20-foot-tall cascade that emptied into a naturally occurring lake encircled by massive rocks. There was a gap in the rock behind the water curtain of the waterfall. It was narrow. It was nearly invisible unless you knew just where to look. Squeezing through the opening, Garrett and 2 of his most courageous men found themselves in a large cavern that was barely lit by the light coming through the pouring water. Inside the cave, they found unmistakable evidence of recent habitation. There was an area where someone had slept with dried leaves arranged as a makeshift mattress. Near this place were remains of meals, bones of fish, and small animals and nutshells. But what really caught? What was on the cave walls caught Garrett's attention. On the rock walls, someone has written and drawn for a long time. There were intricate schematics with circles inside circles and lines joining particular locations. Texts, written in a combination of English and another language that seemed to be Latin, described processes and procedures that didn't immediately make sense. And there were lists of names that Garrett recognized as belonging to the local population, and others that he didn't identify at all. Among the deputies, one had more formal education than the others, sought to understand some of the Latin passages. Although little he was able to interpret was disjointed and unclear, it made reference to ideas like continuity, transfer, and preservation. It spoke of moon cycles, precise celestial alignments, and the need for cautious preparation. It seemed as though someone was recording the steps for a complex ceremony. Garrett gave the order to meticulously record everything. They produced pictures of the walls, recorded the writings, and plotted the cave's exact area, but they were unable to locate Margaret or William Foster. The cave had obviously been used recently, yet it was deserted. Garrett was overcome with a sense of duty as they came out of the cave and back into the daylight. 3 persons were now missing. They had proof of odd rites, symbols, and practices. A woman who seemed to be performing some complex strategy, but they still didn't have Margaret. The missing individuals were not with them. They didn't possess specific solutions, merely additional mysteries layered on top of earlier problems. The investigation's course was drastically altered when the cave behind the waterfall was found. In an attempt to uncover a hidden significance or pattern, Garrett devoted days to examining reproductions of the inscriptions and images that were discovered on the rock walls. He enlisted the teacher of the local Parsons school, a man named Arthur Pemilton, who had studied at a university in the East before going to the Appalachians. Pebbleton studied the substances using academic curiosity, scowling as his gaze swept over the Latin words and symbols. Pembleton presented his initial findings after hours of investigation. The belief in transmigration, the notion that souls or essences might be moved from one vessel to another, seemed to be described in the scriptures. It was an idea that occurred in numerous ancient philosophical and spiritual traditions from the Greeks to Eastern rituals. The schematics on the wall displayed what looked to be a chart of the constellations visible at that. Specific latitude during specific times of the year. The professor noted that many ancient cultures thought that precise astrological periods generated conditions conducive to spiritual pursuits. Solstices, equinoxes, planetary alignments, all were deemed noteworthy. The scriptures clearly noted the spring equinox which had occurred just a few weeks previously. If Margaret actually believed in these notions and was following some type of ritualistic timeline, then possibly the disappearances were tied to certain dates in astronomy. Garrett grabbed a calendar and started writing down the dates of the disappearances. Jacob Mercer had disappeared in late December, close to the winter solstice. Early in February, Rachel Peaton vanished. Not quite an astronomically noteworthy date, but perhaps tied to some other pattern. William Foster had disappeared in April after the spring equinox. There might be more intentional disappearances in the future if there was a real calendar regularity. This insight was concurrently both frightening and beneficial. On the one hand, it provided the inquiry with a tangible potential timeline for the next episode. However, it also implied that more people might be in immediate danger, and that Margaret had a long-term strategy that was carefully thought out. Garrett arranged another neighborhood gathering, this time with a clear goal in mind. He gave an explanation of the calendar pattern's idea and advised everyone who lived alone or on remote properties to take extra safety measures. In order to prevent anyone from being totally alone for the next few months, he recommended creating groups. He also declared that he was sending out pleas for help to adjacent counties and even the state capital, hoping that officials with better resources could assist in the hunt. However, because Appalachia was a distant area, it frequently took weeks for law police to react to requests for help. Garrett was aware that at least temporarily, the community needed to defend itself. He put in place a smoke signal system, campfires at night and throughout the day, which would enable remote properties to communicate impending danger. Although it was a crude approach, it worked well in the hilly area where messages had to travel long distances. May arrived, bringing torrential rains that turned the pathways into rivers of mud and made the search even more difficult. The woodlands were teeming with activity, with bears emerging from their winter dens, deer grazing in the valleys, and birds constructing nests. Nature carried on with its cycles, unaffected by the human drama that was taking place. In its middle, it was during one of these rainy afternoons that something extraordinary happened. A child discovered something partially buried in the mud from the recent floods when he was playing close to the village. The book, or what was left of it, had a ruined binding and pages that were soaked with water. The young man took the treasure to his father, who quickly recognized its potential importance and presented it to the sheriff. Garrett carefully read the book, attempting to extract as much information as he could. Numerous. The pages were unreadable, the ink smeared by water, yet a few areas remained intact enough to read. It was a diary that seems to have been written throughout several months of the prior year, based on the partially visible dates on the entries. The penmanship was neat and courteous, clearly female. Garrett was convinced that this was Margaret Hollis's diary, even if the remaining pages lacked a name. The legible entries were fragmentary and frequently enigmatic, but they offered unnerving glimpses into the psyche of their writers. The previous year's August entry said, "I have found the texts my mother hid before she passed away. Everything makes sense now. Her sacrifice was not in vain. The lineage continues through me. The preserved knowledge must be used no matter the cost. The October entry was even more illuminating. The mountains chose their guardians. Not everybody is aware of this. Where there is ancient truth, they simply see superstition. The gateways must be maintained. The balance is retained. What seems like an end is simply metamorphosis. And a third entry from November shortly before the first disappearance. I have identified the candidates. People who dwell on the periphery and who unknowingly move between worlds. The solstice is coming up. I must be prepared. I must be strong. My mother guides me even in her absence. The words verified what Garrett already suspected. Margaret was not acting rashly or beyond her normal sanity. She sincerely thought she was serving a higher purpose, according to a plan that her mother Adelaide had started many years ago. Margaret believed that the disappearances were a necessary and significant part of something rather than random acts of violence. Pembleton, the professor, received the diary entries from the sheriff. They worked together to try and understand what Margaret had said. Her use of the terms portals, balances, and transformation alluded to a sophisticated cosmology and a perspective on the world that was essentially distinct from accepted wisdom. For Margaret, those mountains were more than just natural features. They were centers of authority, where the line separating the worlds was at its weakest. Pem said that throughout his studies in anthropology, he had read about similar ideas. Certain mountains, caverns, and other natural features were revered by many indigenous tribes in the Americas as locations where the material and spiritual realms met. At these locations, shamans and healers carried out rituals because they thought they could speak with forces that are beyond the normal human understanding. If Margaret had acquired this knowledge from her mother, and if Adelaide, in turn, had learnt it from even more ancient sources, then they were dealing with traditions that could be hundreds or even thousands of years old. It was a possibility that fundamentally changed the course of the inquiry. They were no longer merely seeking a common criminal. They were confronting the final representative of a lineage of secret knowledge. However, whether old knowledge or not, 3 individuals were still unaccounted for, very likely dead. And Garrett had a duty to deliver justice to them and their families. He stepped up his search, concentrating on locations that might have ceremonial importance, such as deep caverns, circular clearings, strange rock formations, or any place that was thought to be unique or sacred. Trackers examined dozens more caves during the next weeks. In some, they discovered prehistoric paintings and sketches of people, animals, and symbols that no living person could understand. Interpret. The mystery was further made more complex by these findings. Margaret was following traditions that existed in these highlands long before any written record. One of the search teams discovered something in the middle of May that at last provided a reliable hint as to Margaret's location. They found the remnants of a recent encampment in a secluded clearing about 15 miles from Parsons. Campfire ashes were there, still a little warm to the touch. They discovered rabbit bones, eggshells, and food scraps close to the fire, and hanging from a low branch of a torn piece of fabric that matched the garment that many people remembered Margaret wearing was found near a tree. Finally, after months of failed searches, they had concrete evidence that Margaret was still in the region. She hadn't fled to distant regions. She was staying in the mountains she was so familiar with. The men scrutinized the area surrounding their tent, searching for tracks or trails that would reveal her whereabouts. Footprints were discovered, however they formed an odd pattern, rather than following a straight line in any direction. The markings in the dirt formed concentric rings around the area, as if Margaret had spent hours merely walking in circles. Another symbol was carved into the ground in the middle of these circles. This one was the biggest and most ornate they had ever seen. While the other half went back for additional soldiers and supplies, Garrett gave the order for half of the party to stay and watch the area. Margaret was likely to come back if she was using this place. An ambush would be set. Wait as long as it takes to apprehend the woman who has spent so much time avoiding justice. Margaret Hollis, however, was far more crafty than anyone knew. The guys who remained protecting the clearing tactically split up, hiding amid the trees in places that provided a complete view of the open expanse. Throughout the afternoon and evening, they alternated silently, keeping an ear out for any sound or movement that may signal Margaret's return. Only the typical noises of nature could be heard in the nearby woodland. Breaking the silence, the singing of nocturnal birds, the stirring of little animals in the undergrowth, the whisper of the wind among the treetops. Golden light emerged through the morning mist as dawn broke. The men were fatigued and frustrated. Margaret had failed to appear. The reinforcement party came around noon, bringing more guns, food, and precise instructions from Garrett. The sheriff had made the decision to keep an eye on the location for at least a week in order to ascertain whether Margaret truly utilized it frequently, or if. It was only a temporary camp she had previously abandoned. Nothing unusual occurred for the next 3 days. The soldiers maintained their places, taking turns watching, maintaining quiet and attentive. However, something changed on the 4th night. One of the lookouts saw something moving at the edge of the clearing at midnight, when the moon was full and high in the clear sky. At first, he believed it was a deer or some other enormous animal, but suddenly the figure emerged entirely from the treeing, and it became evident it was an individual, a woman wearing dark torn attire, long, untidy hair falling over her shoulders, advancing with slow, deliberate strides toward the center of the clearing where the sign was engraved into the earth. To warn the other men, the lookout signaled as agreed. Everyone quietly and slowly positioned themselves on all sides of the clearing. Garrett had given explicit instructions. They wanted to capture Margaret alive without unnecessary bloodshed, but prepared to use force if she fought or tried to flee. The lady reached the center of the clearing and stopped directly above the etched sign. She stood motionless for a long period, her face raised skyward, gazing at the full moon. Then she started singing or talking. It was tough to differentiate. Guttural musical noises that reverberated oddly in the quiet woodland. The sentences flowed in a language neither man recognized. The head of the lookout squad, a deputy called Marcus Dalton, felt it was time to act. He rose from his hiding position. Rifle pointed toward the woman and shouted at her to identify herself and remain still. The other guys also emerged from their hiding places, forming a circle around the area, all their weapons pointed on the lone individual in the center. The woman stopped singing and gently turned her head toward Marcus. Even in the moonlight, he could see her eyes, and what he saw made him hesitate. There was no fear in that face, no surprise. There was only a profound, disturbing quiet, as if she were precisely where she expected to be, as if this was all a part of a scheme that only she knew about. This time, Marcus gave the woman a louder order to identify herself. She didn't answer right away. Instead, a slight smile flashed across her lips, and then she spoke in a husky but clear voice that traveled effortlessly across the clearing. "You have come at the perfect moment. The circle is complete. What was lost will be found. What was separated will be reunited," she added. Marcus didn't understand the words, but something. He took a few steps forward, keeping his rifle pointed, and demanded to know if she was Margaret Hollis and where Jacob Mercer, Rachel Peaton, and William Foster were. The woman tilted her head slightly as if thinking about the question, before responding, "Names are merely labels we place on temporary essences. The people you're looking for are right where they should be, not lost or found, but..." The moon, which had been bright and clear in the sky, was suddenly obscured by clouds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The clearing was plunged into near total darkness, and the men stumbled, disoriented by the sudden loss of vision. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin and ordered 2 of the other men to approach and arrest the woman. They approached cautiously, ropes in hand, ready to tie her wrists and take her back to Parsons. Confusion reverberated as they searched for their lanterns and relighted the torches they had extinguished in order to preserve the element of surprise. A few seconds later, the woman was gone. Just gone. The men rushed to the edge of the clearing, desperately looking for clues as to where she might have gone, but there were no broken branches suggesting a hasty escape through the vegetation, nor were there any new footprints other than the ones she had left when she entered. Nothing to suggest an escape route. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air, or as if the darkness itself had swallowed her. The men spent the rest of the night frantically searching the area, but found no trace of her. When the sun rose, revealing the clearing to daylight, the symbol on the ground had changed. New markings had been added, lines that weren't there before, creating an even more complex pattern. Marcus and his men returned to Parsons, feeling defeated and confused. How would they report this to Sheriff Garrett? How would they explain that they had Margaret surrounded by 12 armed men, and yet she escaped without a trace? The story sounded impossible, but everyone present confirmed every detail. Garrett listened to the report with a somber expression. He didn't doubt his men's honesty, but what they described defied any rational explanation. Clouds didn't appear instantly out of nowhere. People didn't disappear in seconds, surrounded by observers. Something was happening. That was beyond his comprehension, beyond perhaps the comprehension of anyone in that community. Professor Peemelton, when informed of the events in the clearing, offered a theory. He suggested that Margaret might have known of caves or underground tunnels in that area. If there were a hidden entrance in the clearing floor, covered by vegetation or loose earth, she could have simply climbed down through it in the darkness, disappearing from the men's sight. It was a rational explanation, but it would require. The men dug around the central symbol, examining every stone and depression in the ground, until they found what they were looking for. Beneath a layer of carefully arranged leaves and twigs, there was a narrow opening that led down to a natural tunnel in the rock. Garrett organized a new expedition to the clearing, this time focusing on finding possible underground entrances. Margaret was able to know the terrain with extraordinary precision, and to have prepared that escape route in advance. It was an inventive escape route, probably planned months in advance, but Margaret wasn't in the second clearing, and there were no signs of where she'd gone from there. Garrett and 2 volunteers descended with flashlights and ropes, and the tunnel wound through the rock for about 50 meters before emerging into another smaller clearing, completely hidden from the first by a rise in the terrain. It was a trail that multiplied in every direction, some false, some leading to dead ends. It was a maze of paths that only someone with intimate knowledge of the region could navigate with confidence. June arrived, bringing humid heat and intense storms. The community was exhausted physically and emotionally. Months of searching, constant fear, and nightly vigils had taken their toll. Some families began to consider abandoning the area altogether, moving to more populated areas where they would feel safer. Garrett knew he was losing the community's trust. He had promised to capture Margaret and bring her justice, but each attempt ended in failure. The woman always seemed one step ahead, always anticipating their moves, always escaping at the last moment. Then a letter arrived, not sent by regular mail, but left on Garrett's office door overnight. The letter was sealed with black wax and addressed simply to the Tucker County Sheriff. When Garrett opened it, he found inside a single sheet of paper with a message written in elegant handwriting that he recognized from the diary he had found. The message was succinct but impactful. The cycle is almost finished. One remains. When the new moon arrives at the summer solstice, all will be revealed where it began. Come alone if you desire truth. Bring many if you seek only revenge. Garrett stared at the calendar. The summer solstice was barely 2 weeks away, and the spot where it all began could only mean one thing: Margaret's original hillside mansion, where the first investigation had begun months ago, the 2 weeks following. The letter's arrival were the most tense Tucker County had ever experienced. Garrett called a final meeting at the church, showing the letter to the community and explaining its contents. Opinions were immediately and heatedly divided. Some argued that it was clearly a trap, that Margaret was luring the sheriff into a final confrontation where she would have every advantage. Others insisted that it was finally an opportunity to get answers, to discover the fate of the missing, and to close this dark chapter. Reverend Whitmore suggested that the entire community march on the estate on the appointed day in such massive numbers that it would be impossible for Margaret to escape or resist. But Garrett hesitated. The letter clearly stated that he must go alone if he sought the truth. There was something about this distinction, truth versus revenge, that resonated deeply with him. After months of pursuing Margaret, he realized he didn't truly understand her motivations or beliefs. Perhaps it was time to listen to her, too, comprehend what had actually transpired before merely apprehending her. Garrett meticulously prepared in the days preceding the solstice, writing comprehensive letters detailing all they had learned during the investigation, addressing them to state authorities and providing explicit instructions on what to do if he failed to return. He also communicated extensively with his deputies, particularly Marcus Dalton, assigning duties and reassuring them that the community would be protected no matter what happened to him. On the eve of the summer solstice, Garrett went to see the families of Jacob Mercer, Rachel Peaton, and William Foster and assured them that he would do everything in his power to find out the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. He saw the pain in their eyes, the anguish of uncertainty that was, in many ways, worse than the pain of confirmed loss. They deserved answers, and he was determined to get them. The day of the summer solstice dawned clear and warm, and Garrett rose before sunrise, donned his best clothes, checked his revolver and knife, and readied his horse. He had decided to go alone, as the letter had requested. It was a huge risk, possibly fatal, but it seemed the only way to finally achieve some kind of resolution. The ride to Margaret's abandoned property took about 3 hours. The trail was more open now after months of search parties repeatedly traveling the trail. When Garrett reached the top of the hill around noon, he found the house exactly as they had left it months earlier. The broken-in door swinging on broken hinges, the windows boarded up, and the overall appearance of abandonment and decay. But something was different. In the front yard, someone had prepared a designated area. There was a fire pit already built, but not lit. Circles of stones arranged in concentric patterns, and in the center of it all, a simple wooden chair positioned facing the house. It was clearly intended for him. Garrett dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree. He walked slowly to the prepared area, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. When he reached the chair, he hesitated for a moment before sitting down. It felt dangerously vulnerable to place himself in that position, but it also seemed to be what was expected of him. As soon as she sat down, Margaret emerged from the house. She looked different than when she had last been seen in the clearing. Her clothes were clean and mended. Her hair was neat, and she carried a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. Her steps were. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy with months of persecution and suffering. Margaret finally broke the silence, saying, "You came alone. That shows courage or foolishness. I haven't decided which yet, but it also shows that perhaps you are ready to understand." Garrett remained calm and collected as she approached, unhurried and without seeming afraid. She stopped about 10 feet from Garrett, studying his face with those dark, piercing eyes so many had described, and controlled. He asked where Jacob Mercer, Rachel Putton, and William Foster were. He demanded that she answer for what she had done. Margaret tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. Then he began to speak, and what he said challenged everything Garrett thought he knew about the case. She explained that those mountains were ancient, far older than any recent human settlement. Before the European colonizers, even before the indigenous tribes who left their cave paintings, there were others who understood the true nature of those places. The mountains were portals, points where the barrier between life and death, between present and past, between the physical world and something beyond became tenuous. His mother, Adelaide, had discovered these secrets, passed down through generations in texts that had been preserved and hidden for centuries. The knowledge spoke of balances that needed to be maintained, of sacrifices that ensured continuity, of essences that could be preserved through specific rituals performed at precise, astronomical moments. Margaret did not deny having taken Jacob, Rachel, and William from their ordinary lives, but she insisted she had not destroyed them. She had transformed them, preserved their essence, allowed them to become part of something greater and eternal. The symbols, the rituals, all part of a process that transcended ordinary mortal understanding. Garrett listened with growing horror and disbelief. Margaret's words sounded like the rationalizations of a deeply disturbed mind, attempting to use mystical philosophy to defend horrible deeds. He cut her off, stating unequivocally that no matter how she tried to justify her actions, she had taken lives, caused unimaginable suffering, and needed to answer to justice. Margaret grimaced and said she hoped he could understand, but acknowledged that might be asking too much. She then held out the package she was carrying to Garrett and explained that inside were personal belongings belonging to the 3 missing men, things their families would. Garrett took the package carefully, and Margaret took a step back as she started to open it, telling him her part was complete, the circle closed, the balance restored, and that she would not be captured, would not allow herself to be chained, and would not allow herself to be judged according to laws that did not recognize the true nature of reality. She also had her entire diary, not the fragmented pages they had found in the mud, but the entire record of her thoughts and actions over the past year. Margaret turned and started walking toward the edge of the property where the forest started before Garrett could react. Garrett got up and yelled for her to stop, then ran after her with one hand on his revolver but was afraid to shoot her in the back. When she reached the tree, she vanished into the thick undergrowth, and Garrett followed her through the forest, but it seemed as though she knew every tree, rock, and secret path. She moved as though she were a part of the forest itself, flowing through the bush. Shadows. After about 15 minutes of futile pursuit, Garrett completely lost track. He found himself alone in a part of the forest he didn't recognize, surrounded by ancient trees and oppressive silence. He called out Margaret's name, but only the echo of his own voice answered. She had disappeared once again, and this time Garrett had a feeling it would be permanent. He returned to the estate and examined the package Margaret had given him. Inside, he found exactly what she had promised, personal items including Jacob's pocket watch, a brooch that had belonged to Rachel, and William's reading glasses. And there was the diary, pages and pages of elegant handwriting detailing a year's worth of preparation, study, and performance of rituals Margaret believed necessary. Garrett took everything back to Parsons. The families of the missing received the objects with tears and gratitude mixed with renewed grief. The diary was studied by several people, but no one was able to extract from it the exact locations of bodies or evidence that would allow Margaret to be formally prosecuted for murder. It was a document of delusional beliefs, of mystical convictions, but not a legal confession as required by law. Additional searches were conducted over the following months and years, but the bodies of Jacob Mercer, Rachel Peaton, and William Foster were never found. Margaret Hollis vanished completely on that summer solstice day of 1877 and was never seen again. Some believed she had died alone in some deep mountain. The hillside property was eventually abandoned and allowed to decay. Over the years, the forest reclaimed it, with trees growing through the floorboards and vines covering the exterior walls until almost nothing remained of the original structure. However, the locals never forgot. Tales of Margaret Hollis and the Macabre curse of 1876 were passed down through the generations, becoming local legend. To this day, some hikers in the Appalachian. The truth about what actually happened to Jacob Mercer, Rachel Peaton, and William Foster is buried somewhere in those old, silent hills. People in that part of West Virginia report seeing strange lights at night, hearing chants that don't seem entirely human, and discovering symbols carved into trees that no one has ever seen before. Some people even whisper around campfires that Margaret never really left, that she is still in the mountain she loved so much, guarding their portals, keeping their balance, and waiting. If you've read this far on this dark journey through one of the most unsettling cases, please remember to subscribe to the channel. If this story touched you, please turn on the bell to receive notifications about the next mysteries we'll explore together. And maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries are never meant to be fully solved. Some secrets belong in the mountains, protected by darkness and time, patiently waiting for those foolish or brave enough to seek them. Do you believe Margaret? Let's discuss this intriguing and terrible topic. Hollis is still in the Appalachian Mountains. What do you believe actually happened to the missing people?